This is Audible.
Brilliance Audio.
Bluebird Gold by Devney Perry. Performed by Samantha Brentmore and Connor Crace.
Prologue. Dear Elsa, remember those days when you were little and I used to tell you stories? We'd go fishing and I'd tell you a story so you wouldn't get bored. I'd be cooking dinner and you'd be sitting on the counter, kicking your bare feet as I told you about cowboys and bandits. Or we'd be on the dock watching the sunset, and I'd give you the short version of whatever book I'd just finished reading. I miss those days. I miss the way you'd lean your head on my shoulder and hug my arm. I miss the sound of your laugh. I miss counting the freckles on your nose. You're long past the age of enjoying my stories, but there's one I never told you. It's a favorite legend of mine, and it goes like this. Montana was a wild place during the gold rush days, with some of the purest gold in the nation. Pioneers flocked here with dreams of striking it rich. Miners, outlaws, and businessmen arrived on horseback or by wagon and stagecoach. Some traveled with only the clothes on their backs, and the only way they survived our punishing winters was by sheer grit and determination. Montana only keeps the iron-willed, and those miners and early settlers were tough as nails, living on next to nothing, surviving day to day on hopes and prayers. Picture towns made of tents and ramshackle buildings, shanties and dugouts, saloons with hitching posts and swinging doors, general stores selling sacked flour, canned cow's milk, and hard candies for a penny. Every man wore a pistol on his belt, and there weren't enough women to keep those men tame. There were corrupt lawmen secretly leading gangs of road agents, and masked vigilantes stepped in to uphold the peace. Here's where the legend gets interesting. What if those vigilantes were not always on the right side of wrong? There's a lost legend from Garrick, one of the more prominent mining towns in those days, that once a wagon of gold was stolen by a notorious gang. After the robbery, a band of vigilantes went after the thieves, except they returned empty-handed, and the gold was gone forever. Or was it? Rumors began to trickle through Garrick that the vigilantes had in fact found the thieves, and rather than return the gold to its rightful owners, the vigilantes had taken it for themselves, hiding it away, biding their time until they could leave town without suspicion. Only they waited too long. Speculation turned to accusation, and the townsfolk turned on their peacekeepers. Each of the vigilantes who'd gone in search of the stolen gold was hanged for their betrayal. The secret location of the stolen gold was buried with them in unmarked graves. The gold was truly lost, never to be seen again. And that's the story of Garrick's legendary lost gold. I should have told you more stories, Honey Bear. Come to Montana. Come and see me, so I can tell you more stories. Love, Dad.
Chapter 1. Ilsa. January 1983. Once upon a time, I called this cabin on Cotter's Lake home. As I spun in a slow circle, past swirled with present, then and now. Then, a crackling fireplace and the steady clicks from Mom's knitting needles, the scents of cigars and sugar cookies, a small living room but a clean, happy room. A little girl with dirt under her fingernails curled on her father's lap as he read her a story. Now, dust motes floating past dirty windows, stale air with the faint stench of a long-dead mouse, clutter beyond clutter to the point of chaos, a tattered recliner and lonely, quiet rooms. Dad's cabin was smaller than I remembered. The ceilings seemed too short, the walls too close. Probably to be expected, considering the last time I'd been in this house I'd been 16. A lot had changed in the past 10 years. Yet if I closed my eyes, I was that little girl again, curled on her father's lap. My earliest memory was in this cabin. In this living room, I'd been 3, maybe 4. There was a fire burning in the stove. Dad had built it for Mom before he'd left to go ice fishing on the lake because Mom didn't like building fires. She got splinters from the wood. Frost trimmed the windows. The couch was pushed into a corner to make space for the Christmas tree. Mom and I were decorating it with ornaments while she complained about the insufferable snow. That was the day I'd learned what insufferable meant. Mom was upset because we'd had to cancel our shopping trip to Missoula, where they'd closed the roads. I'd been too young to remember her exact words, but the way she'd spoken about Montana had always been such a contrast to Dad's feelings. He'd been sunshine. She'd been gloom. His lifestyle had been her misery. Until the spring I'd turned 6. When the snow melted, the daffodils bloomed, and Mom loaded me into her olive green Oldsmobile and left Dalton. Left Dad. Mom had been lighter after that, happier, but her joy had been the death of his laughter. Their roles had switched. She'd blossomed, he'd withered. Daylight and despair. And somewhere in the middle, me. Always in the middle. Until now, Dad was dead, and there wasn't a middle to occupy. A shiver chased down my spine. Goosebumps dotted my forearms. The fire I'd started in the hearth was rushing to a roar, but it hadn't chased away the cold yet. It had been 20 years since I'd spent a winter in Montana. I'd forgotten just how bitterly cold it could get. I'd been back in Dalton for a week, and the temperatures had dropped lower and lower each day. But despite the cold, the winters were beautiful. Even Mom couldn't argue the splendor of Montana covered in snow. Beyond the filmy windows, the sun had dipped below the jagged mountain horizon. Its fading light tinged the world in blues and violets. The trees looked more indigo than green. Beneath their trunks, the yard was blanketed with snow. Past the boat dock, the frozen lake stretched from one icy shore to the next. Once upon a time, I'd loved that lake. I'd spent countless hours swimming, playing on the gravel beach, and floating on an old inner tube. Strange that I could remember a Christmas from decades ago, but I couldn't remember who'd taught me to swim. Was it Dad? For as long as I could remember, I'd just known how to swim. He'd been a good swimmer, too. Just not good enough. My heart twisted. The pain a constant companion this week. I'd spent most of the past week avoiding this cabin, throwing myself into my new teaching job at Dalton High School. And when I was here, I'd hidden in my childhood bedroom, huddled beneath blankets, blocking out the memories and cold. But a week of surviving in this clutter was enough. I'd come to Montana to settle my father's estate, to clean this cabin and sell it in the spring, to say goodbye. Yesterday, I'd tackled the kitchen. Tonight, maybe I'd find the living room couch. It was buried somewhere beneath a mountain of boxes and bags and whatever else Dad had been collecting over the last 10 years. When I'd arrived last weekend, I'd barely been able to get into the cabin, so I'd focused on cleaning the essential rooms, the bathroom, my bedroom, the spaces I'd needed to survive my first week in Dalton. Everything else, well, ignorance wasn't bliss, but it was my favorite hobby. Except there was simply no more ignoring the hoard of junk my father had amassed in this tiny home. Dad had piled boxes nearly to the ceiling, leaving only narrow paths to move from room to room. The entryway was still overloaded, mostly from stuff I'd moved off my bed so I could sleep. Was this my punishment for not visiting Dad sooner? How long had he been living like this? I should know the answer. But Ike Poe had always been a bit of a mystery, even before I'd stopped coming to Montana for my summer vacations. That mystery would remain unsolved now that he was gone. Maybe in this sea of boxes, I'd learn more about the man my father had been before his death. I walked to the closest stack, stretching onto my tiptoes to heft down the box at the top. A puff of dust billowed off the cardboard as I set it beside my feet. Whatever was inside gave a tinny clatter. Prying open the box's flaps, I did a double take at the contents. Cans. Empty cans. From the looks of it, Dad had been surviving on Campbell's tomato soup and Western family whole kernel corn. I pushed the cans aside, making sure there wasn't anything else in the box. Then I carried it outside, adding it to the growing pile in the snowy driveway. The next 3 boxes were more empty cans. They joined the heap, destined for the dump. As I lifted down the 5th box, heavier than the others and hopefully not full of cans, the phone rang, interrupting my cleaning. It was a Sunday. Troy always called on Sundays. Dread swirled with excitement that felt more like a habit than genuine interest. For years, I'd looked forward to these Sunday calls. I'd made sure, no matter what, I was home whenever my phone rang. I'd loved the familiarity of Troy's voice on a Sunday evening. I'd loved the consistency of talking to my friend, my best friend. Were we best friends? We had been once. I wasn't sure what we were right now. Maybe we were 2 people who needed to stop talking on Sundays. Yet I set the box aside and walked to the phone, lifting the handset from its cradle. Hello?
Hello.
Troy's one word was laced with enough pity to fill 1,000 of Dad's empty soup cans. Did all grieving people reach the point when they were fucking tired of receiving sympathy?
How are you?
He asked. Good, I lied.
Ilsa.
My name in that smooth timbre, and my shoulders sagged. He knew me well enough to hear through a bad lie. I'm taking it one day at a time. I walked to the closest window, stretching the phone's spiral cord to its limit. Beyond the filmy glass, night was falling. It was still early, just after 5 o'clock, but the short winter days meant the sun had already set, giving way to long winter nights. Dad used to say there wasn't a place on Earth that had as many stars as the shoreline of Cotter's Lake after dark. Maybe after I got these windows cleaned, I'd actually be able to see them.
How was the first week in Montana?
Troy asked. I groaned. Rough, but I've got a job.
Yeah, that's great. How's it going?
Well, I'm not exactly sure what the previous teacher was doing with these kids, but it wasn't teaching them math.
That bad, huh?
Beyond bad. I gave everyone a review test on last semester's material. Only half of the juniors and seniors passed. 1/3 of the sophomores, and of the 15 freshmen, only 2 passed. And when I say passed, I mean they each got 70%.
Ouch. Sorry.
There's nowhere to go but up, right? Troy chuckled.
There's that sunny optimism.
A smile tugged at the corners of my mouth. You know me, I'll never give up on a kid.
As you shouldn't. And the house, how's it coming?
I haven't made much progress yet. My focus this past week had been on work. I'd driven into town early each morning and stayed late at the school each evening, trying to make sense of the previous teacher's notes and chaotic filing system. Every student seemed to have a different version of the curriculum textbook, and either they were all putting me through some sort of strange hazing ritual, or none of them actually knew what chapter they'd been on when she left before winter break. It was a 30-minute trip from Cotter's Lake to Dalton, and by the time I'd gotten home each evening, I'd been too tired to tackle the cleaning. Though this weekend, I'd made some progress. Yesterday, I'd scoured the kitchen cabinets and washed dishes and scrubbed countertops so that I could cook and use the sink and stove. This morning, I'd spent hours in the laundry room cleaning out old boots and coats and Dad's collection of fishing gear, moving it to the shed. The door to his bedroom had stayed firmly shut. I wasn't ready to go in there yet, to sort through his clothes. I don't know what to keep, I told Troy, and the fact that I don't know what to keep and what to trash makes me feel guilty. A good daughter who knew her father wouldn't have hesitated. She would have known what he deemed important, what he would have wanted me to have. A good daughter would have cried for the loss of her father. It hurt being here, missing him, regretting him, but I hadn't cried. Not once. Not yet.
Are you sure you want to do this alone?
Troy asked.
We can hire someone to do the cleaning, then you can put it on the market and leave it behind.
No, I whispered. Not that the thought hadn't crossed my mind, but the idea of letting a stranger sort through my father's possessions would only make the guilt worse. Maybe I wasn't much better than a stranger, but at least I was his, and he'd been mine. Besides, where else did I have to go? I need to do this, I said.
Then please, let me come and help.
It was the 10th time he'd offered to come to Montana, and for the 10th time I said, no, I'm fine.
Ilsa.
There was my name again. No pity this time, just scathing disapproval, like I was a child in need of scolding. I hadn't heard that chiding tone from him before, or maybe I had and I'd been so blinded by my love for him that I hadn't noticed. How's Lori? I forced as much sincere curiosity into my voice as I could muster.
Don't do that. Don't change the subject.
I'm not doing anything. I appreciate the offer to help, but this is something I need to do on my own. I'd go through each and every box. I'd deal with the cans and dust and whatever else I uncovered beneath this roof. Because maybe if I could learn who Dad had been in the last years of his life, I could retrace his footsteps. All the way back to that early memory when I'd been a happy girl who looked at her father like he hung the moon. If I started at the beginning, maybe I'd find the point when I'd gotten lost.
I want to be there for you.
Troy said. I know. That was the worst part. If I asked him to be here tomorrow, he'd drop everything to drive from Arizona to Montana. But being here, that was only geography. Whether he was in my living room or his own, whether we were thousands of miles apart or a few short feet, nothing would change. He could be here and not be with me. You didn't answer my question, I said. How is Lori?
She's good. At jazzercise tonight.
Sounds fun. My molars ground together. Asking about his most recent girlfriend was akin to torture, yet I'd asked for the past 3 months, ever since I'd found out they were dating. The same night, I'd come home from dinner to find a police car waiting outside my house and an officer poised on my porch to tell me that my father had died. Troy and I had been out to dinner before that. He'd told me that he'd met someone, that Lori might be the one. Maybe the reason I hadn't cried when that police officer told me about Dad was because my heart had already been broken. It would be easier if Lori weren't a lovely woman. She was sweet, and the few times the three of us had met for drinks, she'd been nothing but kind. She'd fawned over Troy, always touching him, praising him, boasting about him like I didn't already know he was smart and funny and charming. Like I didn't love him too. I'd met Troy first, but it just didn't matter. Timing had never been on our side. For years, we'd dodged and denied a mutual attraction. In the beginning, I hadn't wanted to risk our friendship, and by the time I'd been brave enough to tell him how I felt, it was too late. He'd met someone else. Susie, then Holly, then Brenda, then Tiff. I hadn't waited. I'd moved on, dated, and tried to find my own someone special, and neither of us had ever admitted we wanted more than friendship. But there were feelings, a hope that eventually the timing would work out. 3 months ago, for the first time in years, I'd been single and he'd been single. When Troy had asked me to dinner, I'd thought it was a date. Finally. Silly me. He'd told me all about Lori over breadsticks at my favorite Italian restaurant.
Have you talked to your mom?
He asked. Not since I called her to tell her that I made it to Dalton. Mom didn't want updates about my time in Montana. She was irritated that I'd moved over 1,000 miles away to clean up Dad's mess. She hated that I hadn't simply taken a week off work, dealt with this cabin lickety-split, and returned home. She blamed him for my leaving Arizona, but it was all a ruse to hide her heartbreak. Her entire life she'd been in love with my father, even after she'd filed for divorce. Mom had never remarried. She'd never shown any interest in another man. Yet for as much as she loved Dad, she hated him too. She hated that he'd chosen Montana over her. 20 years ago, when she'd told him she couldn't live here anymore, that she couldn't do another harsh winter and needed more than his small town had to offer, he let her pack our bags. He'd watched from outside this very cabin as we'd driven away. Mom had told me countless times that it was a mistake to come to Montana. that Dad hadn't cared enough about me to leave Dalton in decades. So why would I uproot my life to tidy up the remains of his? Maybe she was right. Maybe if Dad hadn't written me that letter, I would have stayed far, far away. But since the day it had arrived in my mailbox, exactly 2 days after he'd died, I hadn't been able to let it go. So when I'd finished the past semester at the high school where I'd been teaching in Phoenix, I'd packed up my life, putting most of my belongings in storage in my mother's garage. Then, despite the protests from both Mom and Troy, I'd moved to Montana. By some miracle, I'd managed to get a job teaching. It was only temporary while another teacher was on maternity leave, but I wasn't staying in Dalton. Maybe once I finished the school year, once I finished cleaning and selling Dad's cabin, I'd move to the East Coast. Maybe I'd try California or Colorado or Connecticut. Where? That was another day's problem. All I knew was that Arizona was history. Mom could keep her sunshine and scorching summers. I wanted to live in a place with all 4 seasons.
Any idea when you'll be able to come home?
Troy asked. Telling him I wasn't moving back was another day's problem, too. No, but I'd better let you go before this call gets too expensive.
I can afford long distance, Ilsa.
I know, but I'd like to get more work done before I call it a night.
All right, don't work too hard.
No promises.
Next Sunday?
I'll be here. Despite the nagging feeling that our friendship was coming to an end, I'd be here on Sunday, answering the phone the moment it rang.
I'm worried about you,
he said. Don't be. I'll be fine. He scoffed.
Of course I'll worry about you, Ilsa. I love you.
It was a knife through the chest. Did he love me? Did I love him? Or was Troy simply comfortable, like my favorite old t-shirt? Even if it was love, none of it mattered. A long time ago, in this very house, I'd learned that love wasn't enough. Have a good week. I carried the phone to its cradle and hung up. No matter how many calls he made, I never ended them with a goodbye. Deep down, I was too afraid he'd take it as permission to stop calling. God, what the hell am I doing? The wall of boxes didn't have an answer as I turned toward the living room. What are the chances you're all cans? Only one way to find out. The next box I pulled from the stack was full of photographs. I carried it to the kitchen, lifting them out and spreading them across the countertop. They were Polaroids, most faded to black and white and tan and gray, but the face in each square white frame was mine. Every single picture was of me during my summer visits. My nose began to sting, a lump forming in my throat, but my eyes stayed dry. I hadn't cried when the cop told me about Dad's death. I hadn't cried during the 2-day drive from Phoenix to Dalton. I hadn't shed a single tear since I'd arrived in Montana, not even when I'd walked through the front door. Ike had been an absent father to a shitty daughter. Neither of us deserved tears. I picked out a stack of my favorite photos from the massive pile and slid the rest off the counter surface, pushing them into the empty box. Then it joined the others outside. The next box was full of socks and white t-shirts. Everything had been folded perfectly, the shirts in tidy squares. Dad had taught me how to fold clothes. Mom was hopeless when it came to laundry, content to pluck clean clothes out of a basket rather than put them away in her neglected dresser drawers. The summer after we'd moved to Arizona, the first summer I'd come to visit Dad, he'd seen my haphazard suitcase and a pile of clothes on the floor and taught me how to fold. That sting in my nose returned with a vengeance. I closed the lid, leaving everything inside untouched. There was no point in me keeping his shirts and socks. But instead of taking them outside, that box went to the laundry room shelf. It couldn't stay beside the detergent and bleach indefinitely. But for now, I wasn't ready to throw away his clothes. The next box was as mysterious as the cans. White paper napkins filled it from top to bottom, and every single one was adorned with Dad's neat script. I plucked one from the top of the pile. It was a to-do list, the first word capitalized and the tasks punctuated. Each item was crossed out with a straight line except for the last. Buy oranges, mow lawn, change oil. Write Ilsa's letter. The letter. It wasn't crossed off, not on this napkin. Would I find one in the box where he'd checked it off? Because he'd written that letter. It was in my purse, tucked safely in the envelope in which it had arrived. Why had he kept these napkin lists? Making them was normal, sort of. Keeping them, not so much. The cans, the lists, the junk. All signs that my father's mental health had been deteriorating in his final days. Signs I'd missed because I hadn't been around. Dad had called me this past summer and pleaded with me to take a trip. It was the first time in years he'd invited me to Dalton. Come and see me, honey bear. Spend a week on the lake. There's a lot I'd like to talk to you about. A good daughter would have made the effort. Instead, I'd been too busy making excuses. Too busy proving a point. Dad had never once come to see me in Phoenix. Not in 20 years. He'd missed my high school graduation, birthdays, Christmases. Why should I rush a trip on my summer vacation to Montana? Saying no had been my form of revenge. Guilt and regret, as thick as black sludge, crept through my veins. Would it have made a difference? Would I have been able to get him help? Questions I could never answer. A blast of cold swept into the cabin, so I walked to the fireplace, adding another log to the stove. At least I didn't have to chop wood. Dad had built up a stash of wood by the front door that would last me through 2 winters. Not that I intended to stay for more than one. As the new log caught fire, I stood and took in the plethora of boxes, my energy waning. God, there were so many boxes. Tomorrow, after work, I'd unearth the couch. I navigated the narrow path through the mess, about to slink into my bedroom and pull on a pair of warm socks and flannel pajamas to read for a few hours before going to bed. With my hand hovering over the light switch, I gave the boxes one backward glance. And I saw a person wearing a dark ski mask in the dirty kitchen window.
Chapter 2. Cossie. A click of static buzzed through the CB radio in my truck before Chuck's voice came through the speaker. Cossie Rains, you got copy? I sighed and plucked the mic from its cradle, pressing the button as I held it to my mouth. Yeah, I'm here. Over. We got a problem out on Cotter's Lake. I sent Larry, but he just called in. Need a hand. Over. Damn it, I muttered, off radio. Why was it that my deputies could handle anything that came through during the week, but Sunday evenings they needed my help? I raised the mic to my mouth. What's the problem? Over. Lady called in and said there was a man sneaking around Ike Poe's cabin. Over. So what if someone was sneaking around? The cabin was empty. As far as I knew, no one had been out there since Ike had died a few months back. I doubted there was much inside worth stealing. Was it a neighbor complaining? The folks on Cotter's Lake didn't like traffic or visitors on their road. Or maybe someone was breaking in to cause trouble. Either way, Larry should be able to handle this on his own. Who called it in? Over. My money was on Sue Ann Holmes. She was one of Ike's neighbors and didn't understand the concept of mind your own goddamn business. Ilsa, over. Ilsa who? Over, I asked, waiting for a last name. And I didn't get one. Meaning Chuck, who was manning the station's phone today, hadn't bothered to ask. For the last time, Chuck, you gotta get last names every call. Over. Sorry, Sheriff. Over. I sighed. Shit. At this point, tracking down details myself would take less time than trying to relay them through Chuck. Tell Larry I'm on my way. Over and out. The grocery bags in the back of my Bronco rustled as I slowed to make a U-turn on Main Street. So much for dinner at home tonight. I reached for the radio, changing the channel before I lifted the mic again, and said Mom's handle. Knitting needles. Linda Rains loved to knit. The woman went nowhere without her needles, hence her handle. It took her a minute to answer.
Knitting needles here.
Sorry, Mom, I'll be late for dinner. Over.
Again?
Her disappointment was as cold as tonight's below-zero temperature. She was sick of me getting called in on Sunday evenings, too.
Well, that's how it goes, I guess. I'll feed Spencer.
Appreciate it. Hopefully I won't be long. Over and out. I hung up the radio and hit the gas pedal, speeding past the remaining buildings in town. The highway stretched ahead, bordered by towering evergreens as it curved through Dalton's mountain valley. Of course, this call meant I'd have to drive out to Cotter's Lake. Heaven forbid it was somewhere in town, somewhere close. Son of a bitch. I promised Spencer we'd have fried chicken tonight. The mom could spend the evening with him as a grandmother, not a babysitter. We planned to play a card game, then watch TV. It was a playoff game Spencer and I wanted to watch. Neither of us were diehard Miami Dolphins fans, but we both enjoyed watching Dan Marino play. Maybe if I hurried, I could salvage part of the evening, at least spend an hour or two with my kid. Except the moment I turned off the highway, I knew this wasn't going to be a quick trip. The narrow road that led to Cotter's Lake was covered in snow, and it was only so fast I could drive on the icy ruts. There would be no hurrying, not tonight. My hands strangled the wheel as I followed the road, deeper and deeper into the forest. My headlights bounced from one tree trunk to the next. A few overgrown branches smacked the Bronco's side mirrors. There weren't many people who lived on Cotter's Lake, even fewer who stayed through the winter. Most houses up this way were summer cabins. Those few who did stay year-round were, well, reclusive. People who didn't need to come to town often, who didn't care when the road was snowed closed and they'd have to wait a week or two for the county to send up a grader to get it plowed. Who was this Ilsa? I didn't know anyone up here named Ilsa, but the name, it was familiar. By the time I made it to the lake, I still hadn't placed it. Maybe a relative of Sue Ann's? She was always yapping about her many, many cousins from Idaho whenever I bumped into her at IGA. A solid stream of smoke billowed from Sue Ann's chimney as her log A-frame came into view. Her round face was pressed against the glass in her living room. The next house I came to was Robert Aaron's place. Every light seemed to be on, illuminating his home like a torch. 500 yards later, tucked into a cluster of trees and perched beside the lake, was Ike's cabin, the last on the road along Cotter's Lake. I'd expected it to be dark, but golden light spilled from the windows. A plume of smoke trickled from the chimney, and parked beside Ike's two-tone teal and silver Ford Ranger truck was a mint-green Volkswagen Rabbit. Ilsa. I snapped my fingers as it clicked. Ike's daughter. He hadn't talked about her much, at least to me. The last time had been years ago. From what I had gathered, they were estranged. Her choice, not his. What was she doing out here? I parked beside Larry's cruiser, then stretched for the jockey box, snagging a flashlight and the pair of leather gloves Spencer had bought me for Christmas. With them on, I stepped outside, just in time to hear a woman's voice carry from the cabin's open front door.
That window, right there.
She pointed to the side of the house as she barked at Larry.
He was standing right there, staring at me.
Ma'am, she growled.
Deputy, please stop calling me ma'am and find the creep spying on me.
Hell, I did not have the energy to deal with a pissed-off woman tonight. I blew out a long breath and made my way toward the cabin, glancing around as I walked. Footprints littered the snow, some small, some large. Larry, I said as I came up behind him. He whirled from his position on the stoop, his eyes wide and his belly straining the zipper on his black department coat. His frame sagged when he spotted me. Sheriff. What's the problem? He shifted his large frame out of the way.
Are you his boss?
The woman inside stepped forward, crossing her arms over her chest. She was dressed in a cable-knit cream sweater and a pair of jeans that accented her long, toned legs. Her dark hair was pulled into a ponytail, the curls thick and silky draped over one shoulder. Her nose, upturned slightly at the tip, was dusted with freckles. She had a square face, bold but elegant, with full, pouty lips. I rocked slightly on my heels. This woman was a knockout. Definitely not what I'd expected to find on Cotter's Lake. Her big brown eyes locked with mine, and she arched a delicate eyebrow as she waited for me to answer her question. Yes, I'm his boss, Sheriff Cassie Rains.
Ilsa Poe.
Ike's daughter. I didn't realize you were in Dalton.
I've only been here a week.
A week was plenty of time for news to run through town, especially considering Sue Ann kept nothing from the prayer chain. Newcomers were always the rumor mill's hot topic in our small town, and no matter how many years I'd tried to avoid local gossip, it always seemed to find its way to the station. But there hadn't been a word about Ilsa. Well, after tonight, that would change. Between Sue Ann, Larry, and Chuck, the town would be abuzz come tomorrow morning. Ilsa cast Larry a sideways glare as she stepped past him.
There was a man sneaking around the house. He was staring at me through my kitchen window.
Probably because she was the most beautiful woman to grace Dalton in decades. At the moment, I was struggling not to stare myself. Can you describe him? I asked.
No.
She pursed her lips.
He was wearing a ski mask.
Cold night. My breath billowed to prove my point.
Or he didn't want to be seen as he was violating my privacy.
Now I understood why Larry had asked for backup. He could break up a bar fight in less than a minute, go toe-to-toe with any man in Dalton County. His 6'5" frame was intimidating, part of why I'd hired him, even though he was usually a giant teddy bear. But when it came to spirited, pretty women, he lost his nerve and, more often than not, put his foot in his mouth. Would you mind if I take a look around? I asked. She swept out an arm.
By all means.
I jerked my chin for Larry to follow me around the corner of the cabin. Okay, what's going on? He pulled off his stocking cap, raking a hand through his curly blonde hair before putting the hat on again. His cheeks were ruddy from the cold. I got here and introduced myself. She was scared and shaking, so I tried to be nice. I told her it was probably a neighbor. You know how Sue Ann and Robert get. Figured I'd find their tracks in the snow and follow them to whoever was nosing around. Exactly what I would have done. Then why am I here, Larry? There aren't any tracks. I blinked. What? I circled the whole house, twice. Couldn't find anything. I told her there were no signs anywhere, and asked if she'd been drinking. Oh, hell. I swallowed a groan. Let me take a look around. Maybe it's best you head into town. Sorry, boss, I didn't mean to insult her. I know. I'll handle it. I clapped him on the shoulder, then nodded to his cruiser. See you tomorrow at the station. As he lumbered across the icy driveway, I stepped into the snow-covered yard and pulled a small flashlight from my pocket. There might not have been tracks earlier, but they were everywhere now. I recognized Larry's size 13s as I circled the house, as well as a smaller pair, probably Ilsa's. But there were no tracks cutting through the yard, no sign of a visitor coming off the driveway. So I headed for the front door, raising my hand to knock. It whipped open before I had the chance.
Well?
Ilsa asked. I'm sorry, Miss Poe, I don't see signs of anyone but you and Larry. Her nostrils flared.
I'm not making this up.
Didn't say you were.
He was out there.
Ilsa's arms wrapped around her middle.
He was watching me. There have to be tracks somewhere. What about right along the house?
There was a sliver of space beside the log exterior, 6 narrow inches where the eaves protected the ground from snow. Could someone have shimmied along the house? Yeah, but it's unlikely. There were dark circles under her eyes. Exhaustion was written all over her face. Sometimes when people were tired, their minds played tricks on them. She rubbed at her temples, doubt filling her expression.
I swear, it looked like a person watching, and as soon as I looked at him, he ran off.
Probably a neighbor trying to hide the fact that they were here. Though that neighbor still would have left tracks.
That's what your deputy said.
You've got 2 nosy neighbors, in Sue Ann and Robert.
But instead of knocking on the door and introducing themselves, they spy on me.
I wouldn't put it past Sue Ann. Look, it's dark. It will be a lot easier to look around come daylight. How about I send someone out tomorrow to have a look around? She sighed, shoulders curling in on themselves.
All right.
Are you going to be okay out here? We haven't seen the worst of winter yet either. Folks can get stranded out here for weeks. This secluded cabin wasn't a great place for a single woman. Plus, there were plenty of bears and mountain lions that called these woods home.
I appreciate the warning, Sheriff. I'll be fine,
She said as a slight breeze lifted a few errant strands of her hair. It carried her faint perfume, citrus and vanilla, sweet and clean. The kind of scent a man breathes in deep, holds in his lungs. Damn. I took a step away. A gorgeous woman who smelled that good? Oh, trouble. I'd learned a long time ago to stay away from women who meant trouble. Sorry about your dad. My manners kept me from walking away without condolences. He was a good man.
Was he?
The question was asked so quietly I almost missed it. Yes, he was. Ike had been a good man. Sad, lonely, withdrawn, but a good man. I'd been at the station when the call had come in the day he died. His boat had been spotted drifting next to Cotter's Island, without Ike at the motor. We'd found his body washed up on shore not far from the boat. From what we could tell, he'd gone out fishing one morning. He must have slipped and hit his head, then fallen into the water. The last time I had seen him, Ike had been at the bar nursing a beer. He'd worn a haunted look, the expression of a man whose heart was broken. If Ilsa wanted to know about her father, she'd have to ask. It was cold outside, and I was late for dinner. Good night. I lifted a hand to wave goodbye. She had already turned to lock herself in the cabin. The drive home was slow, and the fried chicken I'd picked up at the grocery store had been in the back for so long that the Bronco and everything inside, including me, smelled like grease by the time I pulled into my garage. Good thing Spencer and I both preferred our fried chicken cold. I hauled the paper bags inside, towing off my boots in the entryway, as Mom came storming through the living room. Hi? What's wrong? I asked. Her long brown hair, streaked with gray, was coming out of its braid, like she'd been tugging on the end. She grabbed her coat from the hook beside the door.
Oh, nothing. My grandson is just testing my limits. Apparently, when I go through his schoolwork because I have the audacity to care about his grades, I'm invading his privacy, and now he doesn't trust me.
I missed the days when I'd come home to smiles. Sorry, I'll talk to him.
Good luck.
She didn't bother putting on her coat. She just ripped open the door and made sure to slam it behind her. I pinched the bridge of my nose. Spencer? No answer. Damn it. I carried the groceries into the kitchen. A half-eaten plate of beef stroganoff lay abandoned beside the sink. Next to it was a math test. The red F in the upper right corner was circled twice. What the shit? Math was Spencer's best subject, meaning he had a B-. In everything else, he was lucky to get a D. That B- was carrying his grade point average, and meant he could stay on the basketball team. If he flunked math, the coach would sit him on the bench, and if Spencer didn't have basketball to fill up his free time, then he'd find something else to do, something that would likely get his ass in trouble. Spencer! I hollered this time with more bite. This yell he'd better not ignore. His bedroom door opened, and he came down the hallway that led toward his end of the house. But when he reached the kitchen, he didn't cross the threshold. He hovered in the hall with a scowl. His Levi's were rolled up at his ankles. His plaid shirt was unbuttoned, revealing the plain white t-shirt underneath. There was a hole in the toe of his sock, a pair I'd told him to toss 10 times. I lifted the test. What is this? Spencer huffed and crossed his arms. Ask Grandma. She's the one who went through my things without asking. Because she cares, lay off your grandma. I sighed, dragging a hand over my face. She didn't even ask. She went to my room and dug into my backpack. I said lay off. His nostrils flared. A fuck you was written all over his face. He had the brains to keep his mouth shut. But I was taking Mom's side, which meant now he was pissed at us both. This kid. 14 and we were constantly butting heads. Mom said Spencer was exactly like me, and had been since he was born. We had the same brown hair, the same hazel eyes, the same chin and nose. When he filled out his frame and grew a few more inches, we'd probably have the same build. All he'd be missing was a mustache. But when Mom reminded me that my son was mine in every sense of the word, it had nothing to do with our looks. She was talking about attitude. I was stubborn. My son gave stubborn a whole new meaning. Explain, I ordered. What's there to explain? The new teacher gave us a test. I failed. Seems pretty cut and dry to me. My molars ground together as I fought to keep my cool. That smart-ass tone of his was becoming a habit, and it grated on my last nerve. But over the last couple of years, I'd learned to pick my battles. Mom liked to remind me that when I was 14, I'd been a smart-ass shithead too. What new teacher? I asked. What happened to Mrs. Riley? She had a baby. Already? I didn't think she was due until spring. Spencer blinked. Okay, so this new teacher flunked your test. Says F, doesn't it? Easy, I warned. That earned me an eye roll. I fucking hated eye rolls. Did you try? I regretted the question the moment it flew out of my mouth. Spencer's eyes narrowed, his arms uncrossed and his hands balled into fists at his sides. Then he was gone, stomping to his bedroom and slamming the door. Shit. I flung the test through the air, letting it float to the floor. He couldn't fail math. It wasn't an option. Getting benched wasn't an option. Basketball was the only time Spencer smiled. He loved that team and sport. He was good, too, the only freshman on varsity. How could he fail? Spencer was smart. A lack of intelligence wasn't the problem. But when it came to schoolwork, he applied the bare minimum. Maybe another father would have pushed harder, would have hounded his son to get perfect grades. But Spencer and I were at each other's throats lately. At this point, I just wanted him to graduate. I picked up the test, setting it on the table in the corner of the kitchen, and I made my way down the hall, knocking on Spencer's door. What? He snapped. I turned the knob, surprised he hadn't locked me out. Can we talk? He was on his bed, tossing a baseball toward the ceiling. What's there to talk about? I flunked. I don't want to talk. About math? Or the letter? Spencer snatched the ball from midair, shoving up to his feet so fast, a move like that would have made me dizzy. Then he threw it at the wood-paneled wall so hard it filled the room with a thwack. No, Dad, it's not about the letter. Okay. Definitely about the letter. I failed a test. The new teacher is a hard-ass, and now I'll probably get kicked off the basketball team. Spencer's voice cracked, and with it my heart. I'll talk to your teacher, I said. Find out if there's some extra credit or something we can do. He scoffed. We? I'm decent at math. Spencer picked up the ball from the floor and flopped back on his bed, tossing it in the air again. Whatever. Whatever pissed me off almost as much as an eye roll, but I bit my tongue. I'll stop by the school tomorrow. Good luck, he mumbled. I sighed, backing away from the door. But before I retreated to my room to change and fold laundry, I paused. What's his teacher's name? It's Poe. Of course it was. Fuck.
Chapter 3. Ilsa.
Bitch.
The kid in the last row didn't even bother saying it quietly. He didn't bother waiting until my back was turned to the chalkboard either. The brat said it right to my face after I told him he was going to have to stop talking in my class if he wanted to pass and graduate. He was bold, I'd give him that. Part of me wanted to let it go, pretend I hadn't heard the insult. But I knew that if I let him walk all over me, not a senior in this class would show me an ounce of respect for the rest of the year. What's your name again? I asked.
Paul Johnson.
He chomped on a piece of gum, his jaw flexing as he chewed. The cluster of boys who sat around him shared his arrogant smirk. He was tall, his knees knocking on the underside of his desk. The collar of his polo was popped, the sleeves tight around his biceps. I might only have spent a week at Dalton High School, but if I had to guess, I'd say he was the quintessential cocky senior. Probably captain of some sports team. The guy crushed on by most girls, the guy revered by other boys. A kid who was undoubtedly going to be a pain in my ass. Paul Johnson. I drawled his name from where I stood at the front of the classroom. Go away. His nostrils flared as he kept chewing that gum.
Go where?
I flicked a wrist toward the open door. Anywhere but here. Bye. He hesitated for a moment, chomping that gum so loudly it was the only sound in the room. The other kids swung their attention back and forth between us. Paul glared.
You'll be sorry for this.
I arched an eyebrow. Threats only pissed me off. He called me a bitch again before he walked out the door. First period this semester was going to be rough. I reached for the coffee mug on my desk, lifting it to my lips, only to remember it was empty. Ugh, I groaned. I'd gulped the last cold swig during 8th period when one of my junior students, a boy with blonde hair and a short buzz cut, Henry, I was struggling to put names with faces, had asked if I would be his prom date. I'd told him if he aced my class, I'd be his date. Given a quick review of the assignment he'd set on my desk after the dismissal bell rang, I didn't need to worry about finding a dress. A yawn tugged at my mouth. There was probably a fresh pot of coffee, hot and strong and deliciously bitter, in the teacher's lounge. But I'd rather suffer a caffeine headache than venture into that minuscule lounge again. Not only was the tiny room cloaked in a thick fog of cigarette smoke, but I couldn't stand the thought of another forced smile or awkward wave with a colleague clearly not interested in getting to know the temporary math teacher. The last time I'd ventured into the lounge today, the table had been crowded with a handful of men, all sharing an ashtray. As I'd filled my coffee mug, I'd listened to them talk about the Cold War and the farm crisis while speculating what Ronald Reagan would discuss in his upcoming State of the Union address. Personally, I hoped Ronald Reagan would cover Social Security reform, an opinion I would have shared had a single person made eye contact with me when I'd walked into the lounge. The faculty at Dalton High School was as chilly as the draft blowing through my classroom window. Setting the empty coffee mug aside, I grabbed a jar of water on my desk, taking a sip. The sour taste of pickle brine spread across my tongue, and I grimaced. Not that I had anything against pickles, but I preferred my water flavorless. This jar was one of many that Dad had kept in his kitchen cupboard. In all my life, I couldn't remember ever seeing him drink out of an actual water glass. If he owned any, I hadn't found them at the cabin, but he'd had jars and lids aplenty. After he emptied one of pickles or jam, he'd turn them into his cups and glasses. I'd tossed out those tinged red from spaghetti sauce, but I should have trashed anything with a pickle label too. I yawned for the 100th time today, checking the clock. Another hour to finish up some work, then I'd be calling it quits. 60 minutes. Then I could go home, swap this caramel corduroy dress for a pair of cozy sweatpants, curl up in bed and sleep for at least 10 hours. If I could sleep. After Sheriff Raines had left last night, I'd been so freaked that I'd locked myself in my bedroom with a kitchen knife on my nightstand. Every time I drifted off to sleep, I'd imagine that masked face in my window and pop awake. Someone had been in my window, right? The deputy hadn't explicitly stated that he didn't believe me, but when he'd wandered around the house and found nothing, the skepticism had been written all over his face. Maybe my eyes had been playing tricks on me. It had happened so fast. He'd been in the window, and then nothing. I'd blinked and he was gone. Or no one had been there in the first place. God, I was tired. 8 days in Montana had zapped me dry, and the exhaustion went bone deep. Maybe I had imagined a person in my window. Another yawn stretched my lips. When I'd finally given up on sleep at 3 this morning, I'd gone through more boxes in the living room. A few had been packed with Dad's clothes. Another had been tools. When I'd gone to lift it off a stack, the cardboard bottom had fallen out, and I'd nearly lost a toe to a crescent wrench. Tonight, I'd sleep with that wrench instead of the knife. The tick of the wall clock seemed to get slower and slower and slower. I slumped in my chair, the wheels rolling away from my desk. This was officially the longest Monday of my life, and I was blaming my shitty mood on Paul. My rage had fueled me through lunch, but now I was simply dreading seeing him again in the morning, the little shit. His bad attitude had infected the other seniors, some of the juniors too. Somehow, I had to turn this around. I couldn't be loathed by my students. They were the entire reason I loved my job. Seeing joy on a young face when a child solved a problem fed my soul. Except Paul had called me a bitch. He hated me. It hurt more than I wanted to admit. School had ended 20 minutes ago and the kids were gone, the halls quiet. In Arizona, this was the time of day I'd spend tidying up my classroom and grading papers, preparing for tomorrow, chatting with teacher friends. In Montana, I didn't have any teacher friends. Not yet. And the very last thing I wanted to do was go through the stack of homework sheets on my desk. The idea of seeing all the wrong answers made my skull throb. A throat cleared from the doorway.
Miss Poe.
I swiveled my chair forward, my spine straightening as my boss walked into the room. "Hi, Principal Harlan. How are you?" Stupid question. The frown on his face was indication enough.
Fine.
Harlan took a seat on the corner of my desk, crossing his arms over his chest. He was dressed in brown polyester pants and a starched beige button-down with a narrow taupe tie. His thinning hair was slicked back. He was 5'2", if I was being generous, and whenever we met, Harlan made sure to put himself in a position where he could look down his hawkish nose at me. During my interview, Monday morning last week, exactly 7 days ago, and coincidentally the same day I'd started teaching, he'd paced his office while I'd sat in a chair feeling like I was being interrogated. Thankfully, it had been the shortest interview of my life. 10 whole minutes, and I'd gotten a job. The day after I'd arrived in Dalton, I'd come into the school, hoping they'd need an occasional substitute teacher. I had some money stashed away, but I didn't want to deplete my savings in case I needed the cash for my next big move. So I'd figured substitute teaching could pay for groceries. Harlan's secretary had brought me into his office, and after a few questions and a quick scan of my resume, he'd offered me a job as the high school math teacher. Temporary math teacher. Full-time, starting immediately. Since they hadn't been able to find a teacher to cover classes during Mrs. Riley's extended maternity leave, Harlan was the person who would have had to teach math, and apparently I was the better alternative. Beggars can't be choosers. His exact words. Principal Harlan was a real peach.
I just received a call from Dean Johnson,
he said. Ah. Now this visit and his frown made sense. Dean was Paul's father. He'd called earlier today to chew my ass for kicking Paul out of class. Dean hadn't called me a bitch. No, he'd used bigger words. Incompetent, unprofessional, ignorant. That phone call over my lunch hour had been the low point in my day, though I had a feeling this discussion might take me to rock bottom.
He's rather upset at the grade you gave Paul on a recent test,
Harlan said. Oh, so Dean hadn't tattled about me booting Paul from first period. He'd called about the failed test. Well, he got the answers wrong, which was exactly what I'd told the 2 other parents who'd called me today to complain about their kids' grades. Math was a beautiful thing. There was a single correct answer, no subjectivity, no gray areas. Algebra seemed to be the only constant, dependable part of my life these days. And if Harlan wanted to take that away from me, he'd have to pry it from my cold, dead hands.
How is it that Paul had 100% before winter break, but then he comes back to a new teacher and he's failed the first test in his senior year?
Harlan tapped his chin.
Explain that to me, Miss Poe.
I really hated the way he said my name. Ms. Poe, with the P stressed so hard, I was afraid a glob of spittle would come flying out of his mouth and land on my face. Do you want me to be honest or tell you what you want to hear? The words came out of my mouth so fast I didn't have the chance to stop them. Shit. Normally, I kept those snarky comments inside my head. Harlan's mouth fell open. His eyes flared. Then his cheeks turned an ugly shade of red.
Excuse me?
Beggars can't be choosers. I swallowed the urge to throw his own statement into his flushed face. This temporary job might be more temporary than planned. If Harlan did fire me, I guess I'd spend the next 6 months unemployed and leverage my savings. Dad had left all of his estate to me in his will. I hadn't gone to the bank, so the value was still a question mark. But money wasn't the only driving factor here. The idea of spending all day, every day in Dad's cabin? No. I wanted this job simply for—
To keep listening to this audiobook, I've left you a link in the description so you can do it at no cost thanks to Audible's 30-day free trial.